Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and committed to bringing you ideas and resources that will build your professional development plan. Thanks for listening. If you want to join the nonprofit sector or maybe be a more effective nonprofit leader in the role you have right now, you're in the right place. I'm glad to bring you these weekly conversations with nonprofit leaders who are on the cutting edge of our sector. And if you would do me a favor, find the share button. Usually it's within the episode graphic on your device right now. And you can share this episode with just one other person so we can continue to build a global community focused on nonprofit leadership. Well, I had a fantastic conversation in this episode with Nick Azulay, who is a perfect example of the emerging talent coming in the next generation of nonprofit leadership. And while he enjoys great success now as part of a social impact digital agency called Whole Whale in New York City, his start in the nonprofit sector was not assured. Nick talks honestly about the challenges of being committed to the sector and yet not finding a clear path in. Now, while he illustrates some challenges that are likely familiar to you, he also shares some of the tactics that helped him break through and will certainly give you ideas to use as you continue along your career journey as well. And for you nonprofit leaders listening right now, he makes a compelling case for starting an internship program. What are you waiting for? There are other talented emerging professionals like Nick out there right now, and they want to join your nonprofit organization. Well, don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 152. Just go to the podcast or the news blog at pattonmcdowell.com, and you'll find all of the resources Nick and I discussed, as well as more information on him and the great work he's doing through Whole Whale, especially Whole Whale's University of Resources. Speaking of resources, check out our website, pattonmcdowell.com. Got lots of them to offer you. You can get a copy of my new book, Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter, or maybe you can check out our mastermind program. We are accepting applications right now for both the summer and fall cohorts. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Nick Azulay. Nick, thank you for joining me on the path.
Great to be here, Patton.
I'm excited about this conversation, Nick. You and I have had several leading up to this recording session, and you've got some great things to share with our listeners. You literally represent the kind of talented emerging leader in our sector that I wrote a book about and wrote a book for, because the sector needs young professionals like you who are, I know, literally going to change the way the sector is led, and I'm excited about that. And frankly, Nick, there are a lot of listeners right now to this podcast who are current senior leaders of nonprofit organizations who need to be looking to attract and hire you and hire professionals like you. So I'm eager to get into those topics because I think it'll help a listener who's on the path as an emerging leader or trying to hire you. And so I know you'll add advice on both of those topics. But interestingly, as you came out of Villanova a few years ago, you described to me it was challenging at first. Talk about exactly that.
Sure, Patton. That's a great question. Yes, so I graduated from Villanova University in 2018. It's a school right outside of Philadelphia. I'm initially from the New York area, and I knew I wanted to find a career with an impact. That was very important to me. When I was an undergrad, I studied political science and had a minor in peace and justice studies. So I was exposed to a lot of different social issues and topics, and finding a meaningful career was the top priority for me. And I was very fortunate to have had quite a few internships on my undergraduate career, but I realized that finding an entry-level job in the nonprofit sector was harder than I expected. I eventually pivoted and actually lived abroad for a year. I was very fortunate to have received a Fulbright Scholarship, and I was a full-time English teacher in the Czech Republic. But even then, upon my return, I knew I wanted to go into the nonprofit sector, but it took me a while to find my footing. I had realized that my liberal arts education, which I so value, I
Right.
wouldn't have done anything different, didn't necessarily lend itself to the technical skills that I would need in a lot of different positions at nonprofits. So that was just to describe the challenge. That was the initial kind of challenge for me coming out of school.
It's great to hear that. Let me ask you a question, though. The internships, I guess, reinforced your enthusiasm for the sector. And I would also think, Nick, typically internships can lead to opportunities, but it didn't quite, I guess, get you over the hump, that some of that technical knowledge or skill that you had to acquire.
Yes, both my classroom education as well as my experiential education and internships uh, really kind of locked in my passion to go into nonprofit work. My very first internship position was with an organization based out of Nepal, and I was helping with fundraising efforts in New York. This was just after the devastating earthquake there. So I did a lot of donation management and that sort of thing. And that was a tremendous experience. And just being able to contribute so meaningfully to an amazing cause was such a privilege. But I realized that even then, when I began reading entry-level internship job descriptions, I found that, wait a second, I have a lot of passion, a lot of enthusiasm, but I felt that I still fell short in some ways of the expectations for entry-level job descriptions. So in some ways that was a barrier to entry for
Yes.
me initially in the sector.
I was going to ask you, and I hear this a lot. It's kind of like, how do you expect me to get experience if I can't get on board and actually get the experience that your job description requires? So, all right, so you've reached this kind of barrier. What'd you do? What did you literally do to kind of get over that and get into some of the work you're doing now?
So initially, I changed all my plans and moved to the Czech Republic.
Right.
But on my return, I spent a lot of time just trying to acquaint myself with the sector. I think that one of the challenges, and I think this goes both ways, I think there's in some ways a disconnect between really enthusiastic university students and nonprofits. You have this tremendous passion, this tremendous drive, and young people who are really able and willing to do these social impact jobs and build a career out of that. And I think that, at least in my perspective, it was challenging to get a grasp of what that meant on a day to day.
Right.
I didn't know what a development team did. I didn't have tons of fundraising experience, or you know what I mean?
Right.
So it took me some time to try to figure out. I know what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what my job description would be. And eventually I fell into a program where I did marketing and digital marketing specifically. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But
Right.
it was just a lot of reading, a lot of learning, a lot of interviews that I very quickly realized were for jobs I wasn't qualified for. So I really needed to, in some ways, level up my understanding of what I could offer to an organization and eventually convince someone to hire me.
Well, it sounds like you created your own curriculum. I mean, you did your kind of independent study. Is that fair? Or were you given advice, I guess, going through these interviews, like, all right, I now see what I didn't have experience to relate in that interview. So now I'm going to go back and study more about it.
That's a great point. I did a ton of research, and this is something that I now help young people. I'm still young. I help younger people
Right.
look for jobs in the sector. LinkedIn was my best friend, and the platform's not perfect,
Right.
but it's tremendously useful. What I was doing was I was looking for people who had jobs that I thought sounded really cool, and I worked backwards. What did they major in? What was their first job? How did they get their feet wet? I reached out to some of these people on LinkedIn and tried to um, hear about what their journey was, because it wasn't entirely clear to me. And I think that a lot of nonprofit professionals have untraditional career paths,
That's a good
at least
point.
from my understanding. Whereas some industries, it's very linear. A lot of nonprofit career paths aren't so linear. And in some ways, that inspired me to say, okay, I know my passions, my interests, my skill set. I now need to essentially market myself and chart my own path moving forward.
So tell me about that using LinkedIn. Love that. I'm a big fan of that as a networking tool. So you identified individuals and particularly positions within the sector that you found interesting. Reach out, and did you try to create, conversation, schedule an informational interview, or what did you literally do through the LinkedIn platform?
Yeah, so I would say that there were a couple of categories of people I talked to. Some, quite frankly, were hiring managers. I found myself in interview positions where I realized fairly quickly I wasn't going to be hired.
Yeah.
And I pivoted. And what I did was I asked, listen, like, what advice do you have? Are there particular skills you think I should really hone? There's so much free, great information out there. I realized that my skill set would be in marketing, essentially.
Right.
I loved a lot of different aspects of that and had some experience. So, talking to hiring managers is one. Another was, Patton, I know you have on the podcast, you've had a lot of university development folks on and university advancement folks. Tapping into my alumni network was
Smart.
extremely helpful.
Smart.
Yeah, being able to talk to people, different careers, even late stages in their careers, folks who are at managerial or director levels was helpful, and trying to work backwards and to see where I fit into where my goals to be were.
Yeah, great advice, Nick. Using the platform, I'm sure respectfully reaching out to people through your alumni network, and again, or whatever networks you already have. I think a lot of times even young professionals fail to fully utilize those networks that do exist, and maybe they just hadn't thought about it. And I love the use of strategic networking that you did. I talk about that in the book, actually, in terms of creating conversations and again, respectful of a senior professional's time, but I'm sure you did it well, and love how you pivoted an interview that may have gone south, and many of us might have just said, "All right, forget this conversation. I'm not going to get the job. I'm going to kind of turn it off mentally." You turned it into an actually, "All right, how can you help me?" And it sounds like it paid off.
It definitely did. Yeah. And I will say that for young people, and I think this is, again, Patton, very relevant to your audience, of many of whom are senior leaders in the nonprofit space, but I think especially for young people, just the experience of interviewing can be so meaningful. I learned so much through interviewing. The first one I did terribly. I
Right.
failed every basic question. I didn't know what to do. I could see myself getting better at interviewing and learning throughout that process. And I think that for senior folks or folks who might be hiring, understanding that young people, this is their first time doing this, they have a ton of passion, they have a ton of energy. Thinking about ways to help them can be really meaningful, as it was for me.
That's such a good point. And it makes me think about, and you and I will talk more about this, creating internship programs, but it makes me be even more thoughtful if I'm have an internship program at my nonprofit, giving my interns experience at interviews or putting them in a
Mm.
position to have that kind of professional networking conversation will in fact help them when they do get out there and actually interview. And so we as senior leaders sometimes may overlook that.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point.
All right, let's talk about Whole Whale. What is Whole Whale and how did you find it?
We are a nonprofit digital marketing agency. We are technically a for-profit company, but all of our clients are nonprofits. We are B Corp certified, which means we are required to uphold certain governance and sustainability and accountability best practices. But our goal as a company is to help nonprofits market their cause, market their campaigns, and create real impact using digital tools and technology. And my current role with Whole Whale is as a senior strategist. I develop digital marketing fundraising strategies. I work with advocacy organizations doing legislative work, even. Our work is quite varied, anything essentially that touches the digital space. When I first came to Whole Whale, however, I was not in this position. I've been here a little bit now. I came in as what we call a fellow. And a fellow was, and still is, a program designed to give folks who may not have the technical experience that they need on day one to develop those skills to then be essentially hired if all works out. So the fellowship is an internship program, first and foremost. But the idea is to create a pipeline to full-time employment at our company. So when I first started and I stumbled across this position, this was in many ways a best case scenario for me. I needed the training. I needed those hard skills, if we go back to what I was saying earlier. And this was an opportunity for me to build those hard skills. I learned very technical skills. I learned Google Analytics. I learned Google Tag Manager. I worked on some web development skills. All of those things were things that I learned as an intern, which allowed me to be able to do my job when I was eventually hired full-time on day one.
Yeah, just I love that. And on many levels, which we'll talk about. So you had no guarantee of a job, but you knew you were going to get great training. And what was the timeline, I guess, presented to you when you first started? In other words, if you do this for 6 months, you do it well, there'll be an opportunity for employment. Is that, or what was the timeline?
It's a 4-month experiential learning program where you have various goals depending on your role and what position you're hired in. But at the end of those 4 months, I believe our job description says, based on client needs and financial considerations, fellows would have the opportunity to apply for a full-time job. That being said, most, if not all, of our fellows have been offered full-time employment. So it's definitely a way of creating a pipeline for talent for young people to be able to join us full-time.
How big is the Whole Whale organization in total?
We are now, we've been doing some hiring recently, but we're approximately 25 people now.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And of course, our show notes are going to link our listeners to all of the resources that you and I will continue to talk about. But I guess one thing that strikes me is you're not huge. It's not like there are hundreds of people in Whole Whale, and therefore you have a ton of capacity for interns. And I say that because they're nonprofit listeners who may be like, well, I'm a smaller nonprofit, so I don't know that I could ever even conceive of an internship program. But it seems to me brilliant that Whole Whale conceived of this program. It's attracting talent, and now it's literally employing this talent as the organization grows.
Absolutely, Patton. I think that's a great summation. And I think in many ways, what I appreciate about the program is it is a bridge between young folks looking to get those technical skills and may not have them, as well as organizations that eventually need those skills. But most importantly, they need those highly motivated, curious young professionals. And this is a way of bridging that gap for young professionals who may not have had the experience. But for us, it's been tremendously beneficial. And I can tell you that there are folks now in management and senior management who began at our company as an intern. And it's a core tenet of, I think, what has made our company successful.
It's a great model to consider. And I hope our listeners will kind of allow the brainstorm to happen in their head. As you go back to that 4-month internship or fellowship period, I guess, again, it was a combination. If I'm putting it together, something like this, I'm training, providing training opportunities, but I'm also giving you some access or interaction to clients. Is that fair? So again, if I were a nonprofit, I need to think about training, but also giving you some degree of access.
It's exactly that. So it's a tremendous hands-on training experience. So on the training component, we at Whole Whale use the goal setting framework of OKRs, which are objectives and key results, which
Yep.
I'm sure you and many of your listeners are familiar with. But we use that framework for setting goals throughout the fellowship. So for me, I was trained on digital analytics. So measuring fundraising objectives, marketing campaigns, measuring the effectiveness of Facebook fundraisers, all of those things. And that was my objective, and my key results were some of the day-to-day tasks and daily or weekly goals that I had. That's on the training piece.
Right.
On the experiential piece, I had goals to, say, present a deliverable to a client. And I remember doing that then and how nervous I was the first time talking to a client. And now I manage 3 projects, which is really incredible. But yes, it's a very hands-on experience. We fellows are asked to essentially dive in, but we have a long, supportive onboarding process as well. Folks get to meet with various members of the team. There's lots of trainings. It's really a comprehensive program in that regard.
Well, and you mentioned it. So the goal setting or the OKR process, I guess, literally provides an evaluation tool, right? So or you tell me, were you tested on all of the training, or how literally do the OKRs apply, and how were you evaluated?
Sure. So the OKRs for me was, at least when I went through the program, was essentially a yes or no. Were you able to complete this? Were you
Right.
able to complete this to client deliverable standards? And in my case, the answer was yes. And it was determined that as capacity and needs were, I would be able to stay on full time.
So a built-in onboarding and training and evaluation mechanism allowed you to get comfortable quickly, get access to clients quickly, and now in a relatively short amount of time, I guess you feel. Let me ask you this way. So what were there any other elements of the onboarding and training that you find particularly helpful now?
I had the distinct experience of going through this process during COVID, actually, or the transition from our non-COVID to COVID world. I was in person in the office for exactly 8 weeks during this fellowship before we went remote. So I experienced both an in-person and remote onboarding. But Patton, I think the key to what made my experience so positive was, in many ways, the team dynamics. It's a very helpful and supportive environment that I was allowed to experience. I had colleagues that would, drop what they were doing to answer my questions or to help me. And that support that I had, especially during such a hard time,
Right.
for all of us, was tremendously meaningful. And not even just from other junior staff, from senior staff, from our CEO down, had coffee chats with the CEO. He asked me my goals, my desires, my 10-year plan, all of those things. And that really made me feel welcome. And my manager asked me all the time, what are your goals? What are your interests? So in many ways, even though I had set goals during that process, I was able to shape that experience into what I most wanted it to be. And that was of tremendous value.
Yeah, well, kudos to leadership at all levels at Whole Whale, senior leadership on down, for creating that culture, that enthusiastic and supportive culture. And I like how you said it wasn't just the kind of the textbook of the training program, but it sounds like a genuine outreach by your colleagues to make you feel welcome and encourage you. And I guess, Nick, you alluded to this earlier, that obviously you had to pivot as an organization through the pandemic to virtual programming. But it sounds like you've created such a structure that you can continue maybe to attract and retain talent that are not just there in New York City. Is that right? I mean, are you able to kind of create a hybrid environment that Whole Whale could continue to grow, even utilizing talent that's not literally able to come into the office?
Yeah, Patton, that's a great question. We were lucky that because of how our company worked and we were constantly having client calls, that the digital infrastructure was already in place for us to move to remote fairly quickly. We're really proud, and I'm very proud that we were able to, with full capacity, provide excellent work throughout the beginning of the pandemic and be able to execute our work with little to no interruption. But once we realized that remote work works for us as a company, we began to expand the horizons of where we could take talent from. And we now have folks in every time zone in the United States. We have folks in California, Central Time, Eastern Time, and it's great. We have geographic diversity. We have diversity in many other ways as well. I think that offering remote work, including for folks who will be remote full time, has opened a lot of doors to bring in folks from lots of different backgrounds, as well as expand our capacity to work with communities across the whole country.
Yeah, you said that beautifully. And Chris, I know you can anticipate the pros and cons I'm about to ask you about, because we all, of course, enjoy the personal interaction of being part of a team, and being able to go into the office is important at times. But I'm struck by the opportunity you just described too for a nonprofit, maybe in a remote or more rural environment. If they were to set up an intern or fellowship program, they could interact with students, somewhere else across the state or even across the country. Or maybe you could speak to kind of, are there pros and cons? If I'm a nonprofit leader, I want to take advantage of a program like what you just described, but you're saying it's doable, maybe even if they're not in the same community.
Absolutely. I think it's challenging, but I think it's doable, and in the long run can be tremendously beneficial. All of our clients are nonprofits. We have really diverse clients that work across a lot of different service verticals. And for us to be able to hire folks from communities all across the country, whether it's in the South, the Northeast, the West Coast, even the Pacific Northwest, it enables us to have perspectives and to do our work better. And for interns, I think it's a tremendous opportunity for folks to work with a company and get that experiential education. And it takes time to build a really good remote onboarding internship process. I don't think that that's something that can be thrown together haphazardly.
Right.
We're fortunate that we've been honing our internship and fellowship programs over multiple years, but I think it opens up a lot of doors for nonprofits. It creates a lot of doors both for interns, but also for these organizations. And I think that done right, it can be really beneficial and help diversify your staff in many different ways, and ultimately provide impact down the road.
Well, and especially given that you're working with clients, I know, all over the place. So having your talent pool from across the nation, I guess now, if not globally someday, right? But you're in every time zone, it sounds like, within the US. Who are your ideal client? What represents an ideal client for Whole Whale? I'm guessing you work across sectors and nonprofits large and small, but is it fair to define a certain kind of ideal client that you all work with?
I think we would, if anyone wants to work with us, we'd consider any and all. Most of the organizations we work with are probably mid-size organizations. But to your point, we've worked with political advocacy organizations, we've worked with health advocacy organizations, we've worked with housing crisis organizations and mental health organizations. And what I've so valued about my job is that I've had this hands-on experience where I can learn from our clients. As much as we deliver services to them, we learn so much in return from them as well. And that's of tremendous benefit.
Do you have a favorite project so far, which I guess may help our listeners understand literally the kind of work you do, or if a young professional thinking, hey, I want to do what Nick's doing. All right. So tell me, Nick, about a favorite project so far at Whole Whale, and maybe just at a high level what you did for this organization.
Sure. I think one of my favorite projects is we work with a teen mental health organization. And we've gone through the process of them of creating a new mental health resource center for youth on their website. And we do some pretty heady technical things like SEO and setting up analytics and all these different components. But it was really tremendous to hear that this resource center was being cited by medical professionals at the top. It got referenced by folks at the US government, Health and Human Services, and it was recognized in really tremendous ways. And even just being on the back end of that project, the more technical end, it's really tremendous to see that come to fruition. And as marketers, our job is to help get this content in front of as many people as possible. And when I can see in Google search or Google ads the keywords that folks are typing in on the internet, I can see there's a lot of people out there who need mental health resources or help, and being able to make sure that the content that is very rigorously written and vetted and is in line with contemporary mental health best practices, like that's tremendous. Being able to serve that need is tremendous. So I would say in some ways that's my favorite project, but we've worked on so many that have different asks. But I think for me, that one has a special place in my heart.
Well, it's a great illustration, Nick. Thank you for sharing it. And yes, mental health is appropriately on the minds of every community around the world, especially with what we've gone through over the last few years. So it's neat that you've had a project like that that's allowed you to feel that kind of productive output for an organization that's so deserving. And it's a reminder to all of our listeners, again, their digital marketing strategy and content strategy, which is, of course, what you all do. But increasingly, even locally based nonprofits have to have an effective digital presence. So it was fascinating for me to hear that, hey, you're studying the SEO and the keywords that people are looking for, and thus bringing to that organization an even more kind of dynamic content platform.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And I think for nonprofit professionals out there is another reason to invest in young talent.
Yeah.
We are living, whether we like it or not, in a digital first world. Folks during the pandemic stuck at home, spending X amount of time on the internet. Right now, devastating. Well, we are witnessing a war in Europe firsthand through the internet. The internet is now the center of so many aspects of how we interact as a society. And so many organizations, I think, do a great job at this. But a lot of others, I think, have been somewhat slow to adapt. And it's not their fault. This is really complicated stuff. It's hard to stay on top of the best practices and everything. But in terms of hiring young staff, young people, they're digital savvy. They know how to communicate to these audiences. And that's a tremendous asset to an organization. Being able to market themselves on social media, navigate technical platforms can be so important from not only a fundraising perspective, but an advocacy perspective, getting awareness about your cause, educating people on your service vertical. We do patent, we worked on some projects regarding vaccine awareness. We've worked on projects about getting real medical information to people and serving those communities. And, social media marketing, it might sound, I don't know, trivial to certain people, but it's so important. It's the exposure of that content that can make the real difference. So young people provide tremendous assets when it comes to digital communication. And I think, if not for anything, that alone can serve as a really important driver or a really important point in the need to hire young staff who have grown up with these platforms.
So well put. And again, further reinforcement to the whole conversation you and I are having and the points I hope our listeners are going to take away. And I think there is a listener right now that's like, all right, this makes total sense. I'm a nonprofit leader. I need to do what Nick is telling me and start a program to attract the kind of talent that he represents. So your point earlier, however, was, don't just kind of slap an internship together and think it's going to work without some preparation. So if I'm a nonprofit leader, I know that I need the emerging leader talent, and I want to start a fellowship or an internship. What would you do? Are there some kind of high level advice that you might offer, Nick, for somebody who wants to start a program like the one you went through?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the first comes down to the job description. I think a lot of young folks are looking for entry-level roles at nonprofits and finding that entry level is not entry level. It's
right.
2+ years experience. It's 3+ years experience. And like you said, it's that catch-22. How do you get experience when you need it to get a job, but you don't have it? So I think writing job descriptions, understanding where these recent graduates are at is really important. Even as well for internships. I think also understanding that the benefits of an internship go both ways. They are for your organization. You're able to hire an intern, but they're also for the intern themselves. So communicate what they will learn out of this. Speak to them. This is what you will gain from the internship. I think really explicitly and clearly stating that can be really beneficial and help build kind of that two-way trust. Continue to build that bridge. Recognize that your interns, they're going to have certain skill sets. They'll have knowledge. They'll have knowledge about digital platforms that especially older and smaller nonprofits may need advice on. Speak to them with regards to that. Place job descriptions where they're likely to see it. Place it on platforms like LinkedIn, Idealist. I spent so much time scrolling through Idealist job boards and reaching out to folks on LinkedIn. Get it out there on platforms that young folks are interested in. Even lots of universities use tools like Handshake or other kind of job platform tools. I think it's important to put it out there. In terms of creating an internship, back to my first point, I think it's really important to focus not only on what your organization will gain, but what you will help that intern gain. And that education component, building that in to any internship program will build that two-way trust. They will learn, they will get something tangible from that experience, as will the organization. And I think a lot of organizations, if you're able, this is now a vehicle for you to hire extremely motivated, curious, driven young talent.
Fantastic. Nick, you could not have articulated that any better in terms of, I think, a couple takeaways. One, clarity of the job description. And I like the way you put it. It's a two-way street there. What the intern will be expected to do, but what the intern will get out of the experience. And that's important. And then in essence, the marketing of the job description, because I think that's good for nonprofit organizations in general to be on the radar screen of LinkedIn, Indeed, and Idealist, and any of these kind of platforms. But also I'm thinking about the local or regional or even statewide universities and higher ed institutions, right? So the fact that you're posting internships also, to me, signals to future job seekers that, hey, we're a nonprofit on the move. We're looking for talent. And this internship maybe is just one part of that kind of talent ladder.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Nick, this has been fantastic advice on both sides. As you promised, you have delivered, both for the emerging professional thinking about their career path, as well as the current nonprofit leader that needs to bring that kind of talent into their organization. Is there anything else that you would say now to your former self, your younger self, the recent graduate Nick, looking for a job in the nonprofit sector? Any other advice you'd offer that person? And of course, there are many people listening who are exactly like you, maybe just coming out, trying to figure out what to do next.
Sure. I think the best piece of advice I ever got was from someone I spoke to when I was networking via LinkedIn, an old connection. And she said to me, it's okay if what you do and what you do to make money at first are different things. And to me, that essentially broadened my ability and took off a little bit of pressure to find the perfect job. Patton, I'll be honest, when I was looking for a job, I was searching for 5 or 6 months, right? I thought I had this great resume. This would be super easy. It wasn't.
Right.
And
right.
I eventually found this job that ended up being tremendous for me, but it wasn't at my dream nonprofit. It wasn't at exactly, doing what I studied in school. And that piece of advice allowed me to essentially take a risk, right?
Right.
And as it turns out, in this program and through my professional development, I've learned leaps and bounds above what I think I would have learned and gained in some of the other jobs I was looking at. So I think just take that pressure off of yourself can be really important, because if you're really driven to do something, work in a specific cause, work on a specific project or with a specific organization, it will happen, even if it's not linear. And the other thing is be gentle with yourself. Finding a job at any point in time is challenging with all the really complicated global events and news, the pandemic. It can be exhausting. And I think that just throughout the process, being gentle with yourself is important, and treat every interview that you take and every job that you don't get as a learning experience. That was for me really beneficial and helped me eventually land the job I'm in now.
That's fantastic advice, Nick, all around. Thank you. There's enough pressure on job seekers, particularly first-time job seekers. And so your reassurance is wonderful, and I'm delighted to share it as well as all of the information, resources, ideas you have shared. So for that, I'm grateful. Of course, as you know, I have one more parting gift I'm going to ask from you, and that is a book that has been meaningful to you on your journey that maybe you'd share with our listeners right now.
Absolutely, Patton. So the book that I am going to recommend is Nonprofit Management 101, a complete and practical guide for leaders and professionals. It's published by Wiley, and it includes a bunch of different essays and chapters written by various nonprofit professionals. And the story of how I stumbled upon this book is quite funny. We were moving out of our office, our lease expired, and, commercial leases are very expensive in New York. So we let it expire during the pandemic. And I ended up with a stack of 10 of these that I was rescuing from the office. And I decided to take one, and I began reading it. And I realized that it is the perfect introduction to the nonprofit world on every topic. What is a board? What's the difference between a C3 and a C4? What does nonprofit development mean? And what I love about this book is I think it can be a great overview for that young professional who doesn't necessarily have the tons of institutional experience at an established organization. This is a great overview. So this is my recommendation. It was really, really helpful to me, and has helped me understand my clients and their work better as well.
I'm laughing at because you and I shared this book before we hit the record button. I love it. I'm working on a graduate course to teach, and that is, in fact, one of the books I'm going to put on the required reading list. And it sounds like you're vouching for it. And for that, I'm grateful. And it also is another reminder for the younger or the emerging professional is you need to learn the language. You need to learn those fundamentals that textbook absolutely provides. So thank you for sharing it. And we will happily put it in the show notes, as well as more information on you and the great work you're doing at Whole Whale. Where would you suggest our listeners go to learn more about both yourself and Whole Whale?
Absolutely. So I recommend that folks interested in learning more go to wholewhale.com. Our website is chock full of amazing, great free resources, particularly related to digital marketing and digital fundraising. Also, wholewhale.com/university or Whole Whale University has a full suite of educational course content for nonprofit marketing professionals. There are full-length courses. Our premier course is our fundraising course. It's 4 hours long. It goes through our whole fundraising philosophy and is just a great way for folks who are trying to either improve their knowledge or begin their journey of learning about nonprofit marketing to get involved. So definitely recommend checking that out. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them via email or contact me in another way.
You're awesome, Nick. Thank you for all of this information. I encourage our listeners to check out the show notes for this episode to learn more and hopefully put in place some of these great ideas you have that about attracting and retaining talent at nonprofit organizations. Nick, thank you for joining me on The Path.
Thank you, Patton. It's such a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Nick as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can guide you on your journey into the nonprofit sector or maybe further along. And hopefully it'll give you some ideas that will allow your organization to better engage emerging talent like Nick. Don't forget about the show notes. They are available on our website, pattonmcdowell.com. You can find out more about Nick, more about Whole Whale. Just check out episode number 152. As always, thanks for sharing this episode with someone else on the path. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to this podcast. Also, pattonmcdowell.com. Go to the podcast page and you will find the follow button. And that will link you to any of the primary podcast platforms. Don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. And if you like this episode, click on the episodes button also on that podcast page. And you can scroll down now through over 150 episodes. Great content, great conversations. I hope you will review any and all of them. Thanks for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now. And keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.